The first thing she knew was the heat. It was a living thing, a hungry beast with a scorching breath that blistered her skin and stole the air from her lungs. It pressed in from all sides, a suffocating blanket woven from smoke and the screams of dying wood. The air tasted of ash and something else, something coppery and final that clung to the back of her throat. Pines, the very ones Thomas had felled and squared with his own 2 hands, were surrendering to the flames with deafening pops and cracks, a sound like God snapping the world's bones. Ilara was on her knees in the dirt. The earth was cool in some places, hot in others, a shifting map of the inferno's reach. She felt the grit press into the flesh of her knees through the fine Belgian lace of her wedding dress. The dress, hours ago, it had been a cloud of pristine white, a testament to a future bright and clean. Now, it was a ruin. The hem was blackened and frayed, and a constellation of soot and blood stained its bodice. It was a cruel joke, a shroud for a life that had lasted no longer than a candle's flicker in a gale. Her world had shrunk to this clearing, to the orange and yellow monster that was once their home, and to the still, quiet shape a few feet away. That was Thomas. It was his body, but the life, the laughter, the gentle strength that had been him was gone. It had been blown out like a lamp. Her mind refused to fully grasp it. It was too large a thing, too heavy to hold. Grief was a colossal wave she could see on the horizon of her soul, a towering wall of dark water, but it had not yet reached the shore. For now, there was only the shock, a hollow, buzzing emptiness in the center of her chest where her heart should have been. Her thoughts were not thoughts at all, but jagged shards of memory tumbling through the void. The Reverend's kind face, his voice droning on about love and forever. The weight of Thomas's hand in hers, warm and calloused, a promise of safety. The scent of sawdust and fresh paint inside the cabin they had built together, their sanctuary. Then, the slam of the door, a sound that had ripped the afternoon in two. The face of Silas Blackwood, a man Thomas had called his partner, his features twisted into a leering mask of greed, the glint of the pistol in his hand, the deafening roar that had filled their small world, the look of surprise on Thomas's face before he fell. It all played over and over, a silent, flickering picture show in the theater of her stunned mind. She did not know how long she knelt there, a statue carved from disbelief. The sun began to bleed away behind the jagged teeth of the western mountains, painting the smoke-choked sky in bruised shades of purple and red. The heat on her skin was the only thing that felt real, that and the cold, dead weight in her soul. Miles away, Cale was moving through the sagebrush, his steps making no more sound than a shadow passing over the land. He was tracking a big cat, a cougar that had grown bold, taking calves from the sparse ranches that dotted the high plains. His world was one of signs and silence, the turn of a leaf, the scent on the wind, the depth of a print in the dust. These were the words of the language he understood best. Years of living alone, of surviving on the edges of a world that had no place for him, had honed his senses to a razor's edge. He saw the smoke first, a thick black pillar climbing into the twilight, staining the clean canvas of the sky. It was in the wrong place for a campfire, and too angry for a lightning strike. It was deliberate. Trouble. He changed direction, his moccasined feet carrying him effortlessly over the broken ground. He moved with a liquid grace, a man who was part of the landscape, not an intruder upon it. He smelled the tragedy long before he saw it. The bitter, acrid scent of scorched pine was sharp, but beneath it was something else, the metallic tang of fresh blood on the dry air. It was a smell he knew too well. He slowed his approach, his hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle cradled in his arm. He crested a small rise and looked down into the clearing. The scene was a tableau of violence and loss. The cabin was a skeleton of fire, its roof collapsed, its walls roaring torches against the growing dark. A man lay on his back in the dirt, his fine wedding clothes a stark contrast to the stillness of death. And then he saw her, a woman in a ruined white dress, kneeling in the ash and dust, her posture one of utter desolation. She was not screaming, not crying. She was unnervingly still, her eyes fixed on the flames as if she were trying to burn her own memories away. Her face, smudged with soot, was a mask of vacant horror. His first instinct was the cold, detached assessment of a tracker. He scanned the ground around the clearing, his eyes missing nothing. The tracks of 3 shod horses, one with a distinctive chip in the left rear shoe, the deep, scuffing prints of heavy men's boots. This was no accident. It was an attack, a murder. He filed the information away, his mind a precise catalogue of details. But then his gaze returned to the woman, and the professional wall he kept around his heart began to crumble. He saw more than just a victim of a brutal crime. In her profound stillness, in the utter destruction of her world, he saw an echo of his own losses. He saw the face of his Pawnee mother, her eyes wide with fear as the soldiers came. He felt the loss of his tribe, scattered to the winds by disease and broken treaties. He felt the familiar ache of being an outsider, a man of 2 bloods who belonged to neither. He understood the kind of emptiness that hollows out a person from the inside, leaving only a shell. He had to let her know he was there. Startling her could be dangerous for them both. He shifted his weight, deliberately putting his foot down on a dry twig. It snapped with a small, sharp sound that seemed impossibly loud in the crackling silence. The sound shattered Ilara's trance. She flinched as if struck, a raw gasp tearing from her throat. Her head whipped around, her eyes wide and wild with terror. She scrambled backward through the dirt, crab-walking away from the sound, her ruined dress tangling around her legs. Out of the deepening dusk, a figure emerged. He was tall and broad-shouldered, a silhouette against the dying light. As he drew closer, she could see long, dark hair that fell past his shoulders, skin the color of burnished copper, and a face that looked as if it had been carved from the hard rock of the mountains themselves. In her panicked state, she did not see a man. She saw another threat, another nightmare stepping out of the shadows to finish the work Silas had started. Her hand scrabbled in the dirt, her fingers closing around a piece of charred wood, still warm from the fire. She brandished it like a club, a pathetic, desperate weapon against the imposing figure. Cale stopped. He saw the terror in her eyes and held his hands up slowly, palms open, showing he carried no immediate weapon. He kept his rifle pointed at the ground. His voice, when it came, was low and calm, a stark contrast to the crackling inferno beside them. "I mean you no harm." The words were simple, but they were the key that unlocked the gate. The sight of this stranger, the sound of a human voice, the sudden, crushing realization of her utter and complete aloneness in this hostile world. It was too much. The great wave of grief, the one she had seen on the distant horizon, finally crashed upon the shore of her consciousness. A single, ragged sob escaped her lips. It was a wounded, animal sound. Then another followed, and another, until her whole body was shaking with the force of her sorrow. The numbness shattered, and the pain flooded in, immense and suffocating. The tears she had been unable to shed now streamed freely down her soot-stained cheeks, carving clean, pale paths through the grime. Cale watched her break, his face impassive but his eyes filled with a deep, somber light. He began to walk toward her again, his movements slow, careful, and deliberate, the way one might approach a terrified, wounded animal. He did not offer empty words of comfort, no hollow platitudes about things being all right. He knew they were not. He simply knelt a respectful distance from her, his presence a solid, silent anchor in the swirling chaos of her world. He unhooked the canteen from his belt and held it out to her, the simple offer of water, a basic act of human kindness, felt as monumental as if he had offered her the world. She stared at the canteen for a long moment, her ragged breaths catching in her throat. She was trying to regain some semblance of control, to rebuild the shattered walls of her composure. with a shaking, filthy hand. She wiped at her face, smearing the soot and tears into a gray paste. Pride, the last bastion of the woman she had been that morning, asserted itself. "I do not need help," she choked out, the words a raw whisper that was nearly lost to the fire's roar. "I do not want your pity." The statement was absurd. She was kneeling in the ruins of her life, wearing a bloodied wedding dress, her husband dead beside her, but it was all she had left. She was Elara Fairchild, daughter of a once proud family from back east, a woman raised to be strong, to be self-reliant. She would not be reduced to a pathetic, broken thing pitied by a stranger in the wilderness. Cale looked at her, and his dark, unreadable eyes held not an ounce of pity. What she saw in their depths was something far more profound, and far more startling. Understanding. It was an understanding so complete, so resonant, that it quieted the storm inside her for a brief second. He had seen this kind of pain before. He had felt it in his own bones. He saw the fierce, stubborn flicker of her spirit still burning beneath the layers of trauma and grief. Without a word, he closed the small distance between them. He knelt before her, and the scent of sagebrush and leather filled the air. He gently reached out and took the piece of charred wood from her trembling hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle, the calloused pads of his fingers warm against her cold skin. He did not try to hug her or soothe her with more words. He simply lifted his other hand and cupped her face, his thumb moving to brush away a single tear that tracked a path through the soot on her cheek. The gesture was impossibly intimate, yet wholly respectful. It was a deeply human touch that asked for nothing in return. He leaned in, his dark hair falling forward to curtain his face, and he pressed his lips, soft and warm, to the tear-stained path his thumb had cleared beside her eye. It was not a kiss of passion, not a kiss of romance. It was a kiss of shared sorrow, a silent acknowledgement of her pain that bypassed all her defenses, all her pride, and spoke directly to the wounded core of her. In that one, simple gesture, beside the dying embers of her life, a fragile, unspoken connection was forged between two strangers in the vast, lonely heart of the West. He drew back, his eyes still holding hers. "They may come back," he said, his voice still low and even. "It is not safe for you here. The night brings predators, not all of them four-legged. We must leave." His logic cut through the fog of her grief. He was right. The men who had done this, Silas's men, might return to ensure there were no witnesses left. She was weak, her body trembling with a bone-deep exhaustion she had never known. But she forced herself to nod. He rose and offered her a hand. She took it, and he gently helped her to her feet. She swayed, her legs unsteady, and he kept his grip on her arm to steady her. Before they could turn to go, she stopped him, her gaze falling on Thomas. "We cannot just leave him." Cale understood. He looked at the hard-packed earth, then back at her. It would not be easy, but it was necessary. "No," he agreed. "We will not." It was a grim, hasty task. They had no shovels, only their bare hands and a splintered plank from the cabin's ruined porch. Cale did most of the work, his powerful shoulders moving with an efficient, respectful rhythm. He dug into the hard, dry ground, his hands scraping against rock and root. Elara knelt beside the shallow grave, clearing away loose dirt, her torn and dirtied fingernails a testament to this final act of love for her husband. He was no longer just a stranger who had found her. He was a witness to her farewell, a partner in her grief. They laid Thomas to rest as the last of the embers from their home died down to a dull, red glow. There were no prayers, no words spoken. The silence was heavier and more sacred than any sermon. When it was done, they stood for a moment in the gathering chill. The world was dark now, the moon not yet risen. Elara looked one last time at the smoldering ruins, a black scar on the land, and at the small mound of fresh earth beside it. Everything she had been, everything she had hoped for, was buried here. As they turned to leave the clearing, the vast, indifferent wilderness of the west closed in around them. The jagged silhouettes of the mountains clawed at a sky littered with a billion cold, distant stars. The mournful cry of a distant coyote drifted on the wind, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness in Alara's heart. A biting wind swept down from the high peaks, cutting through the thin lace of her dress and chilling her to the bone. Cale stopped and, without a word, shrugged out of his worn leather duster. He wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of him, of dust and leather and the wild, clean scent of the pines. The warmth of it was a small comfort in the immense cold. The nearest town, a place called Harmony Creek, was days away on foot. Her survival, she knew with a terrifying certainty, was now intrinsically linked to this quiet, enigmatic stranger who had kissed her tears beside a burning cabin. Her old life was gone, turned to ash and buried in a shallow grave. A new, frightening, and unknown existence had just begun. Dawn came not as a gentle promise, but as a cold, gray accusation. The numbness that had been a merciful shield for Alara had worn away in the night, leaving behind a pain that was both physical and profound. It was a dull, throbbing ache that started in her soul and radiated outward to every muscle, every bone. The shock was gone, and in its place was the brutal, heavy reality of her loss. The first full day of their journey was a torment. The land they traveled was a cruel, unforgiving place, a monochrome world painted in shades of dust and despair. The sun was a relentless hammer in the vast, empty sky, beating down on the cracked earth and sucking the moisture from the air. Jagged rocks and thorny, skeletal bushes were the only features in a landscape that seemed to stretch onto an infinite, hopeless horizon. Every step was an agony. Her fashionable wedding shoes, made for dancing on polished floors, were shredded within hours by the sharp stones. The thin leather offered no protection, and soon her feet were a bruised and bleeding mess. The ordered, comfortable life she had always known, a life of soft carpets and polite conversation, seemed like a dream from another lifetime. Here, the only realities were pain and survival. She stumbled frequently, her body weakened by shock and the lack of food, her mind a fog of grief. She would catch herself turning to share a thought with Thomas, the habit of a lifetime, only to have the emptiness where he should be slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. In stark contrast to her faltering struggle, the man beside her moved through this harsh environment as if he were born of it. He was a study in quiet competence. His grace was not the refined elegance of a ballroom, but the innate, fluid efficiency of a predator. Where Alara saw only dry, cracked earth, he would stop, kneel, and push aside a tangle of roots to reveal the dark, damp soil of a seep spring, offering her cool, clean water in his cupped hands. He pointed out the pale, fleshy pads of a prickly pear cactus, and with a few deft movements of his knife, stripped it of its spines and sliced the moisture-rich fruit for her. He warned her away from a deceptively lush-looking plant with milky sap, telling her simply, "Poison." He did all this with an economy of words that both fascinated and intimidated her. His actions were his language. After a particularly painful fall that left her sobbing in frustration as much as pain, he stopped. Without a word, he unstrapped a small roll from his pack. From it, he took a square of tanned leather and a piece of cured rabbit hide, the fur still soft and thick. He took one of her ruined shoes, examined her bloody foot with a detached, clinical air, and then began to fashion a makeshift moccasin. He wrapped the soft hide around her foot and secured it with the tougher leather, his movements precise and unhurried. He did the same for her other foot. His silence was not cold or dismissive. It was watchful, considerate. It was as if he were in a constant, silent dialogue with the land itself, and she was simply a part of it that needed mending. Ilara's internal world was a battlefield. Her mind swung violently between two opposing forces. One moment, she would be drowning in a debilitating wave of grief, Thomas's smiling face swimming before her eyes. his voice a ghostly echo in her memory. The next, a sharp, defensive pride would surge through her. She was acutely aware of her dependence on this stranger, and she hated it. He was a half-breed. The term, ugly and dismissive, echoed in her mind with the voices of her upbringing. He was a man society had taught her to see as lesser, as unpredictable, as dangerous. Yet this man was the only reason she was still alive. This contradiction tore at her. She would catch herself watching him as he walked ahead, noting the subtle shifts in his expression as his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, reading the story of the land. She felt a confusing and unwelcome mix of gratitude and resentment. She was grateful for his skill, for the water he found, for the protection he fashioned for her feet. But she resented the profound vulnerability that made his help so necessary. Her weakness was a constant, humiliating reminder of all she had lost. She tried to assert what little independence she had left. "I can carry that," she said, her voice raspy, gesturing to the small canvas sack that held their meager supplies. He stopped and looked at her, his dark eyes assessing. He did not argue. He simply handed her the sack. The weight was not great, but in her weakened state, it felt like a sack of stones. She squared her shoulders, her pride a brittle shield, and walked on. She lasted less than 100 yards before her legs buckled, the world tilting and fading to gray at the edges. Before she hit the ground, he was there, a steadying arm around her waist, taking the sack from her nerveless fingers. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say anything at all, which was somehow worse. He simply slung the sack back over his own shoulder and helped her to her feet, his touch firm and impersonal. The silent rebuke to her foolish pride stung more than any words could have. They walked on into the second day, a silent pair moving through a silent world. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to change. The brilliant, merciless blue bruised to a dark, angry purple in the west. The air grew heavy and still, charged with a strange, electric tension. Cale stopped, his head tilted, sniffing the wind like an animal. "Storm," he said, the single word, a quiet command. It came upon them with terrifying speed. The mountains seemed to give birth to a monster of black cloud that rolled down the slopes, swallowing the light. The temperature plummeted, and the first drops of rain, fat and icy, began to fall. Within minutes, the deluge was upon them. The rain did not fall. It came down in solid, wind-driven sheets that stung the skin and stole the breath. There was no time to seek or build a proper shelter. The world was a maelstrom of roaring wind and crashing water. Cale grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a dark slash in a nearby rocky outcrop. It was a shallow overhang, barely a cave, offering a meager shield against the storm's fury. They scrambled inside, soaked to the skin and shivering. The space was tight, forcing them into a proximity that was both a comfort and a trial. Cale spread their one wool blanket over both of them, and they huddled together, their bodies pressed against each other for warmth. Outside, the wind howled like a legion of grieving souls, and brilliant flashes of lightning lit the stark, drenched landscape in ghostly white, followed by claps of thunder that shook the very rock around them. In the cold and the dark, with the storm raging around them like the wrath of God, Alara's last shred of composure finally broke. She began to tremble, a deep, violent shaking that had nothing to do with the cold, the terror she had kept at bay, the raw, unfiltered horror of the attack came rushing back. The lightning flashes were the flash of Silas's pistol. The roar of the thunder was the deafening blast that had ended Thomas's life. "Thomas?" she whispered, his name a broken thing on her lips. "Oh, Thomas." Cale felt the shudders that racked her body. He did not shush her or offer empty comforts. He had seen this breaking before. Instead, he shifted, pulling the scratchy wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. He wrapped his arm around her, drawing her back against the solid warmth of his chest. His presence was immense, a grounding force against the chaos within and without. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her spine, a rhythm of life in a world of death. "You are safe," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her ear, the words vibrating through her. "The storm will pass." He did not speak of her loss, of the man she mourned. To do so would be an intrusion, an assumption he had no right to make. Instead, he began to speak quietly of his own past. "My mother," he began, his voice soft, almost lost in the wind's howl. "She was Pawnee. She taught me that a storm is not an angry thing. It is just the sky cleansing itself, washing away the dust, the sickness, so that new things can grow." He paused, and Alara found herself listening, clinging to the sound of his voice. "When I was a boy, I was caught in a blizzard in the high country. I thought the world was ending. I was afraid I would die." He shifted again, his arm tightening around her. "But the sun rose the next day. The world was still there. It was just cleaner." He had offered her a small, simple piece of his own pain, a story of fear and survival. He had built a fragile bridge between his loneliness and hers. The gesture was so unexpected, so deeply kind, that it broke through the last of her defenses. Alara leaned back into his warmth, burying her face against his rough sponge shirt, and wept. She cried for Thomas, for her lost future, for the terrifying, unknown path ahead. Her tears soaked his shirt, but he did not pull away. He simply held her, a silent, steady presence in the heart of the storm. And for the first time since the cabin door had slammed open, she felt a flicker of something other than terror and loss, a fragile, tentative sense of safety. The intimacy between them was not of the body, but of something far deeper. It was a communion of two lonely, wounded souls, finding shelter in one another. The storm broke at dawn. The howling wind quieted, and the rain softened to a whisper, then stopped. A pale, clean light filtered into their small shelter. The air was cold and crisp, smelling of wet earth and sage. The world outside seemed washed anew, every rock and thorn bush glistening as if it had just been created. The shared vulnerability of the night had irrevocably shifted their dynamic. The chasm of strangeness and suspicion that had separated them had narrowed. When Alara looked at him now, in the clear morning light, she did not see a dangerous outsider. She saw a man who had shared his warmth and his past to comfort her. Her guardedness began to soften, replaced by a tentative, hesitant trust. She realized with a jolt that she did not even know his name. "I am Alara," she said, her voice still thick from sleep and sorrow. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers for a long moment before he answered. "Kale," he said. The formal exchange felt significant, a proper beginning. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by tragedy, but two people with names, with histories. As they continued their journey, their interactions changed. A silent partnership began to form. He started to teach her, pointing out the subtle signs of the trail, a broken twig, a disturbed pattern of stones that told of a passing deer. He showed her how to find the driest kind of kindling, the dead branches clinging to the undersides of junipers, that would burn even when the world was damp. She, in turn, began to contribute in the ways she could. Her mind, once she could clear it of the fog of grief, was sharp and keen. She looked at the crude, hand-drawn map he carried and helped him ration their dwindling food, her intellect providing a different kind of survival skill. It was during one of these quiet moments, huddled over a small, smokeless fire, that she began to talk about Silas Blackwood. She told Cale everything she knew, every detail she could remember about his greed, his ambition, the way he looked at her land, at Thomas's land, with a hunger that had frightened her even then. Cale listened intently, his expression growing grim, his jaw tightening as she spoke. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. "Blackwood?" he said at last, the name a hard stone in his mouth. "I have heard that name, spoken by settlers whose wells have mysteriously gone dry. spoken by Ute hunters who find their trapping lines cut. It is a name that travels with fear. His words were a cold comfort, a validation that what she had experienced was not just a personal tragedy, but part of a larger, darker pattern. They were not just fleeing a memory. They were being pursued by a continuing evil. The proof came the next afternoon. Cale, scouting ahead, suddenly froze. He dropped to one knee, studying the ground with an intensity that made Alara's heart pound. He motioned for her to be silent, to stay back. After a few long, tense moments, he returned to her side, his face hard. "Tracks," he said, his voice low. "3 riders. One horse has a chip in its left rear shoe." Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. It was the same detail he had noted in the clearing by the cabin. Silas was not content to leave a witness. He was hunting them. The threat was no longer a ghost from the past, but a clear and present danger dogging their heels. The knowledge was terrifying, but it also had a strange, clarifying effect. It sharpened their focus, burning away the last vestiges of their former lives. They were no longer a rescuer and a victim. They were allies, partners in a desperate fight for survival. The shared danger stripped away the last of Alara's foolish, learned prejudices, leaving only the raw, undeniable reality of their situation. This man, this quiet, competent half-Pawnee tracker, regardless of his blood or his past, was her only hope. The town, when they finally saw it, was both a blessing and a curse. From a distance, Harmony Creek was a promise of safety, a sign of civilization in the vast, empty wilderness. But as they drew closer, the promise frayed and unraveled. It was not the bustling, hopeful town Alara had imagined. It was a collection of weary, wooden buildings, huddled together as if for protection against the relentless wind that scoured the plains. A single main street, a river of thick, brown mud from recent rains, cut through its center. The entire place seemed to sag under the weight of a tired, dusty sky. Relief at having arrived was quickly soured by a profound disappointment. The faces that turned to watch them were not welcoming. They were hard, suspicious, and etched with the weariness of a difficult life. Eyes peered at them from behind grubby windows and shadowed doorways, and every gaze felt like a judgment. Alara, her wedding dress now a tattered, grimy relic of a forgotten life, hidden beneath Cale's oversized duster, felt 100 pairs of eyes strip her bare. Walking beside a stoic, armed man with skin the color of the earth and long, dark hair, she was an immediate spectacle, an object of scorn and whispered speculation. The whispers followed them like flies, a low, persistent buzzing just at the edge of hearing. Fallen woman. Look at the state of her, a disgrace, running with an Indian. The words were sharp little stones thrown from the shadows, and each one found its mark. The sanctuary she had longed for was turning out to be just another kind of wilderness, one with crueler predators. They sought out the only authority the town had to offer, the sheriff. His office was a small, cluttered room that smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed bodies. Sheriff Jebediah was a portly, lethargic man whose stained vest was stretched taut over a considerable belly. He sat with his boots propped up on his desk, picking at his teeth with a sliver of wood, and regarded their entrance with an air of profound boredom. Alara summoned the last of her strength, the last of her breeding. She pushed back the hood of the duster, stood as straight as her aching body would allow, and spoke in the clear, measured tones of the woman she once was. She told him her story. She recounted the wedding, the joy, and then the brutal, violent attack. She described the fire, the murder of her fiancé, Thomas, and she named Silas Blackwood as the man who had pulled the trigger. Her voice was steady, but it cost her everything she had. The sheriff listened, his expression never changing from one of mild indifference. His gaze flicked from her disheveled appearance, lingering on the bloodstains on her dress, to Cale, who stood silently and watchfully by the door, his presence filling the small room. When she finished, a heavy silence fell. Jebediah slowly took his feet off the desk and spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. He scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "Silas Blackwood?" he said, as if the name itself were proof of her foolishness. "Ma'am, Silas Blackwood is this town's biggest benefactor. He owns the Double Horn Ranch, the Mercantile, half the saloon. He is a respected man." He leaned forward, his small, piggish eyes narrowing. "You come in here, looking like you do, with him." He jerked his chin toward Cale. "And you expect me to believe a wild tale about Mr. Blackwood?" He leaned back, a smug look on his face. He implied, with his tone and his sneer, that she was either a hysterical, grieving woman whose mind had snapped, or worse, a liar trying to extort money from a good man. He turned his dismissive gaze on Cale. "As for you, I do not know what your business is here, but I suggest you and the lady move along. We do not like vagrants causing trouble in Harmony Creek." The injustice of it was a physical blow. Alara felt the air leave her lungs as if she had been punched. The law, the institution she had been raised to trust, to believe in as a shield for the innocent, was nothing more than a tool for the powerful. It was a lock on a door, and Silas Blackwood held the key. The hope that had carried her across the plains withered and died in that foul-smelling room. Despair, cold and absolute, threatened to overwhelm her. But then she looked at Cale. He had not moved, had not said a word, but she saw the quiet, coiled anger in his posture, the tightening of his jaw, the way his dark eyes had gone flat and hard as stone. Seeing his controlled fury mirrored her own, and in that shared, silent rage, she found a new and terrible resolve. They were truly on their own. This town was not a sanctuary. It was a cage. They left the sheriff's office, the weight of the town's hostility pressing down on them. They needed a place to rest, a roof over their heads. But no respectable boarding house would have them. They found their lodging in the only place that would not turn them away, a small, drafty room above the livery stable. The owner, a gruff, one-eyed man named Silas who, by a cruel twist of fate, shared a name with their enemy, looked them over, grunted, and took their money without a word. He was not kind, but he was not cruel, and Alara sensed he was one of the few people in town not directly on Blackwood's payroll. The room was small, cold, and smelled deeply of hay, horses, and manure. A narrow cot and a single rickety chair were its only furnishings. But it was a private space, a door they could close against the judging eyes of the world. The shared, cramped space forced a new level of intimacy upon them. They ate their meals of stale bread and dried meat sitting on the floor, their backs against the wall. Their conversations were quiet and purposeful, whispered plans for what to do next in a town that was clearly a dead end. Social prejudice became their constant, unwelcome companion. The next day, when Alara ventured out to the general store to buy bandages and what little food they could afford, the owner's wife, a thin-lipped woman with disapproving eyes, served her with a palpable disdain. She overcharged for every item, her movements sharp and resentful. Outside, men loitering on the boardwalk would stop their talking as she passed, their eyes crawling over her with a lewd, speculative hunger. They saw a ruined woman with a ruined dress and made their own crude assumptions. Cale endured worse. He was a visible target, an immediate focus for the town's fear and hatred. When he entered the saloon, looking only to fill his canteen, the chatter stopped. A thick, hostile silence fell over the room. The bartender refused to serve him, his face set in a hard line. Men at the bar called him savage and half-breed to his face, their voices loud with the courage of the pack. Cale absorbed the insults with that stony stoicism Alara was beginning to understand. His face was an unreadable mask, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the deep well of pain and anger he kept carefully hidden. His resilience in the face of such casual, venomous hatred deepened the quiet admiration she felt for him. an admiration that was slowly, frighteningly, turning into something more. The ugliness came to a head one evening. Alara was returning from the town well, a bucket of water in her hand, when a group of 3 men stumbled out of the saloon and blocked her path. She recognized them as ranch hands from their dusty clothes and the brand on their belts, Blackwood's Double Horn. They were drunk, emboldened by liquor and their unquestioning loyalty to their boss. "Well, well," the leader sneered, his breath sour with whiskey. "Look what we have here. The little liar. You lost, ma'am?" They fanned out, cornering her against the wall of the livery. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched the bucket handle, her knuckles white. "I hear you have been telling tales about Mr. Blackwood," another one said, stepping closer. His eyes were small and mean. "He does not like liars, and we do not like liars' women." Their intentions were menacingly clear. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She opened her mouth to scream, but before any sound could escape, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the stable doorway. Cale was there. He had not made a sound. One moment they were alone. The next, he was between her and them. He did not draw the knife at his belt or the pistol tucked into his waistband. He did not need to. He moved with a swift, brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. The first man lunged, and Cale met him not with force, but with a fluid redirection of movement. A sharp, precise strike to the man's elbow joint resulted in a sickening crack and a howl of pain. The second man swung a clumsy fist, and Cale ducked under it, his own fist driving hard into the man's solar plexus, knocking the wind and the fight out of him in one explosive gasp. The third, seeing his companions fall, hesitated for a fatal second. Cale closed the distance, his hand shooting out to grip the man's wrist, twisting it at an unnatural angle. A quick, disabling blow to the side of the neck, and the man crumpled to the dirt. It was over in less than 5 seconds. It was not a barroom brawl. It was the calculated, lethal art of a man who had been fighting for his life for a very long time. Cale left them groaning in the mud and turned to Alara. He took the bucket from her hand, his grip on her arm firm but gentle, and pulled her away from the scene and into the relative safety of their room. Back in the small, hay-scented space, the adrenaline fled, leaving Alara trembling with a delayed reaction of fear and white-hot outrage. Cale lit the lantern, the soft glow pushing back the shadows. His eyes, dark and intense, scanned her from head to toe, checking for any injury. Seeing that she was physically unharmed, the tension in him seemed to change, to curdle into something else. He turned away from her, presenting her with his rigid back. He stood staring at the rough wooden wall, his shoulders stiff with a suppressed fury that seemed to vibrate in the small room. She saw his hands, at his sides, clench into tight, white-knuckled fists. He was angry at the men, she knew, but he was also angry at himself, angry for not being there sooner, angry for the danger his very presence, his very existence, brought upon her. She moved up behind him, her heart aching for him, for the unjust weight he carried. She gently placed her hand on his tense arm. "It was not your fault," she said softly. He turned then, and the look on his face stole her breath. The stoic mask was gone, and in its place was a raw, naked torment that twisted his features. "With me, it will always be like this for you," he said, his voice a raw, grating sound she had never heard from him before. "They will never see you as anything but a fallen woman, and me as anything less than an animal." In that moment of gut-wrenching honesty, she saw past the tracker, past the survivor, to the lonely, wounded man beneath. A man who had been judged and condemned his entire life, simply for the blood that ran in his veins. A powerful, defiant wave of emotion rose in her. Gratitude, admiration, and a fierce, burgeoning love that would not be denied. She stepped closer, into the space between them, and rose on her toes. She placed her hands on his shoulders, and she kissed him. This kiss was nothing like the one by the burning cabin. That had been a kiss of shared sorrow, a gentle acknowledgement of pain. This was a deliberate act of claiming. It was filled with her gratitude for his protection, her defiance of the ugly world outside their door, and all the powerful, unspoken feelings that had been growing between them in the shared hardship of the trail. It was a silent declaration. As clear as any vow, I choose you. Your world is my world now. I am not afraid. For a second, he was still, shocked into immobility. Then, with a low sound deep in his chest, he responded. His arms came around her, pulling her tight against him, and the kiss deepened, becoming a desperate, passionate affirmation of their bond. It was a raw and hungry kiss, a kiss that pushed back against a world that wanted to tear them apart, a fierce claiming of a small piece of light in an overwhelming darkness. The incident, and the kiss that followed, galvanized them. They could no longer wait for justice or hope for acceptance from a town that hated them. They had to fight back. Hiding was a slow death. Later that night, as they sat in the quiet dark, Ilara's mind raced, sifting through memories, searching for a weapon. She thought of Thomas, of their plans, of the things he had told her in confidence. And then it came to her. A conversation about Silas, about his meticulous nature. Thomas had suspected him of cheating their partnership. "The ledger," she whispered into the darkness. Cale shifted beside her. "What ledger?" "Thomas kept a private ledger," she explained, her voice gaining strength with the clarity of the idea. "He was cautious. He told me once he recorded all of Silas's dealings, every land purchase, every cattle sale. He thought Silas was using the ranch to launder money from other activities, land grabs, rustling, extortion." The pieces fell into place with chilling certainty. Silas had not just wanted Thomas's land, or her. He had wanted to silence Thomas to get that ledger. That book was the proof of his entire criminal enterprise. Their partnership shifted in that moment. They were no longer just two people trying to survive. They were two people with a mission. Their new goal was clear, sharp, and dangerous. Find the ledger. It was their only proof, their only weapon against a man who owned the law. Their quest was no longer for survival, but for a calculated and dangerous justice. The decision to hunt for the ledger, to actively seek justice instead of merely running from injustice, changed Ilara. The grief for Thomas remained, a permanent scar etched upon her heart that would ache on cold nights and quiet mornings for the rest of her days. But it was no longer a paralyzing fog that clouded her mind and stole the strength from her limbs. It had cooled and hardened into something else, a cold, burning anger, a sharp and focused desire for retribution. The fire that had consumed her home had also burned away the last of her softness, the last of her naivete. She was no longer the genteel bride-to-be who had arrived in this harsh land full of delicate hopes. The cruelty of the trail and the corrosion of the town had stripped her down to her very foundations, and what was left was not brittle porcelain, but a core of tempered steel. She began to contribute to their strategy not as a follower, but as a partner. Her mind, once occupied with household plans and social niceties, became a sharp, analytical tool. She spent hours in the quiet of their small room above the stable, meticulously combing through her memories, recalling every detail she could about Thomas's business. She resurrected forgotten conversations about Silas, piecing together fragments of information about shipments, land deeds, and whispered rumors, searching for any clue that might lead them to the ledger's hiding place. Cale watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and a deep, aching concern. He saw the woman she was becoming, strong, resilient, and fiercely intelligent, and a quiet admiration bloomed in his chest. But he also saw the toll it was taking. He saw the new hardness in her eyes, the way she sometimes forgot to eat, the exhaustion that pulled at the corners of her mouth. He saw a woman forcing herself to walk through the ashes of her own heart, and he worried that the fire would consume what was left of her. He began to teach her. His lessons were practical, born of a lifetime of solitude and survival, but they were also his way of caring for her, of giving her the tools to protect the fierce spirit he had come to cherish. He taught her not just for the wilderness, but for the far more dangerous world of men. He took the knife from his belt and showed her how to hold it, not as a tool for skinning game, but as a weapon of defense. He taught her where to strike, how to use an attacker's weight against them. The lessons were grim, and Alara's hands often shook, but she learned. He taught her how to see. He walked with her at the edges of the town at dusk, teaching her to be aware of her surroundings, to notice the things that were out of place, a new set of horse tracks, a shadow in a doorway that lingered too long, the way the town dogs fell silent. He taught her how to move without being seen, how to use the shadows and the noise of the wind to her advantage, to become a ghost in a town that was already haunted by her presence. These lessons were his silent language of love, his way of empowering her, of giving her back a measure of the control that had been so brutally stolen. Their investigation began in earnest. Under the concealing cloak of darkness, they became whispers in the night, two shadows moving through the muddy alleys of Harmony Creek. By day, they were prisoners in their small room. By night, they were hunters. Cale would slip out of town and use his peerless tracking skills to observe Silas Blackwood's ranch from the distant hills. He spent hours lying motionless in the sagebrush, mapping the patrol routes of Blackwood's men, noting the shift changes, identifying the weaknesses in the ranch's security. He would return before dawn with a mind full of details. And Alara, using her sharp understanding of business correspondence and logistics, would help him make sense of what he had seen. A late-night wagon arriving from the north might mean a clandestine shipment. A well-dressed visitor from the territorial capital could signify a meeting with a corrupt official. They were a formidable team, a perfect fusion of his primal, earthbound knowledge and her civilized, analytical intellect. Their search for the ledger eventually led them to the small office Thomas had rented on the main street. Silas had wasted no time. A thick, new padlock secured the door, and a notice from the sheriff's office declaring the property sealed was tacked to the wood. Breaking in was their first major risk together, a deliberate step from being victims to being outlaws in the eyes of the town's corrupt law. That night, under a sliver of moon, Cale worked on the lock with a length of stiff wire. The tension was a palpable thing between them, a third presence in the dark alley. Every distant dog bark, every creak of a floorboard from a nearby building, sent a jolt of fear through Alara. Finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them, plunging themselves into a dusty, stale darkness. Cale struck a match, and in the flickering light, Alara's heart seized. The office had been ransacked. Papers were strewn across the floor, drawers were pulled out, and the furniture was overturned. But worse than the mess was the smell, faint but unmistakable. The scent of Thomas's favorite pipe tobacco still lingered in the air. The scent was a ghost, and it ambushed her, hitting her with a fresh, crippling wave of grief. For a moment, she could almost see him sitting in his chair, a ledger open on his desk, a gentle smile on his face. She pushed the feeling down, forcing it into the cold, hard place where she now kept her anger. She could not afford to grieve now. They had a purpose. They searched the small office for over an hour, their movements quiet and desperate. They checked every drawer, every book, ran their hands along every inch of the floorboards, but they found nothing. Silas had clearly been there first, and he had been thorough. Despair washed over Alara. She sank into Thomas's uprighted desk chair, the deep ache of failure settling in her bones. It was hopeless. Silas had won. Her hand fell to her side, her fingers brushing against the underside of the chair's wooden armrest. She felt something, a small, uneven shape. Her fingers explored it, tracing the familiar outline of a small, whittled bird. It was a meadowlark, a symbol Thomas had always used, a carving he would whittle when he was deep in thought. This one was loose, as if it had been worked on recently. Acting on a desperate, illogical hunch, she worked her fingers around the carving. It shifted, and then came free in her hand. Behind it was a small, hollowed-out space, empty. But the discovery sparked an idea, a sudden, brilliant flash of insight. Thomas would not have kept something as important as the ledger in a place this obvious, this predictable. He was far too cautious, too meticulous for that. He had known Silas was a dangerous man. Her mind raced back, not to his business, but to their dreams. She remembered a cold evening, sitting by a fire, planning the final details of their cabin. They had spoken of the great stone hearth, the heart of their home. Thomas had laughed and said they should build it with a special loose stone, a secret place to hide valuables, a just-in-case cache. It had seemed like a romantic, fanciful game at the time. Now it felt like a prophecy. "It is not here," she whispered, her voice alive with a new, frantic energy. She looked at Cale, her eyes shining in the lantern light. "It is at the cabin. It has to be." The journey back to the ruins of her life was fraught with new and more immediate dangers. They were no longer just running. They were heading toward the one place Silas would expect them to return. They knew his men would be looking for them, so they had to travel off-trail, through more difficult and treacherous terrain, moving only at night and hiding during the day. The shared danger and singular purpose deepened the bond between them. Words became less necessary. A glance, a slight nod. The brief touch of his hand on her back was enough to communicate entire sentences. The pretense of being just allies in a desperate situation had fallen away, weathered by the trail and burned away by the intimacy of their shared struggle. It was replaced by an undeniable and powerful current of love and desire that flowed between them, as real and constant as the wind. One evening, they made camp in a place that felt like a secret gift from the earth itself. It was a small, hidden canyon, a pocket of impossible life in the desolate landscape. A clear spring trickled from the rocks, feeding a grove of cottonwood trees whose leaves whispered in the breeze. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and wild mint. The sheer beauty of the place, its peaceful seclusion, stood in stark contrast to the ugliness of the world they were fighting. They ate a silent meal of dried meat and foraged roots. As the stars began to appear in the deep purple sky, a profound sense of peace settled over Alara. Here, in this hidden sanctuary, with this man, she felt safe. When the meal was done, she turned to Cale. The desire that had been a low, simmering heat between them for weeks, ever since that kiss in their room at the livery, finally boiled over. There was no hesitation in her, no coyness or maidenly fear. The woman who might have felt those things had died in the fire. She reached for him, her touch on his arm a clear and unequivocal statement of her feelings. He turned to her, his dark eyes questioning, searching hers in the dim light. "I want you," she said, her voice steady and clear, with no trace of shame. "Not out of loneliness or fear, but because you are the one who sees me, all of me, the woman I was, and the woman I have become." His breath caught. He saw the truth of her words in her eyes, the raw, honest desire that mirrored his own. He raised a hand to her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his touch both a question and a prayer. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes for a moment, and then she guided his face down to hers. Their coming together was not gentle or sweet. It was a raw, passionate, and cathartic release of all the pain, fear, and unspoken longing they had suppressed for so long. It was a desperate affirmation of life in the face of so much death, a fierce and tender claiming of one another against a world that had given them nothing but sorrow and hardship. In the shelter of the canyon, under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars, they found not just pleasure, but a profound and healing solace. Afterward, they lay in each other's arms, wrapped in their shared blanket, their bodies still humming with the aftershocks of their passion. A deep sense of peace settled between them. For the first time, they spoke of a future, their words tentative and fragile, whispered into the vast, silent dark. "If we survive this," Kale murmured against her hair, "what will you do?" "I do not know," she answered honestly. She turned in his arms to face him. "But I know I will not do it alone." Their moment of peace was shattered 2 days later, as they navigated a treacherous series of rocky canyons. A patrol from Silas's ranch, wider flung and more determined than they had anticipated, stumbled upon their trail. The hunt was on. A tense chase ensued, the sound of hoofbeats and angry shouts echoing off the canyon walls. They were cornered, trapped in a box canyon with 3 riders blocking the only exit, their rifles raised. Kale shoved Alara behind a large boulder. "Stay down," he commanded. He knew they were outgunned, but he also knew the land. His eyes darted upward, assessing the loose scree and precariously balanced rocks on the canyon wall above their pursuers. It was a desperate gamble. He broke cover, firing his rifle not at the men, but at a key point on the rock face above them. The riders returned fire, bullets screaming past him, chipping stone from the boulder that shielded Alara. Kale fired again, and a deep groaning sound answered him from the mountain. A cascade of small pebbles turned into an avalanche of rock and dust. The rock slide was a terrifying, thunderous thing. It poured down the canyon wall, not on top of the men, but directly in their path, blocking the canyon mouth in a choking cloud of debris. The men's horses reared in terror, and the riders scrambled to escape the rolling boulders. They were saved. They had escaped, but not unscathed. As Kale scrambled back behind the boulder, Alara saw the dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his left arm. A ricocheting bullet had torn a deep, bloody gash along his forearm. The close call was a grim, brutal reminder of the stakes. Their love, so new and so powerful, had given them everything to live for. But in this unforgiving land, it had also given them everything to lose. The bullet wound in Kale's arm was deep and ragged, a brutal tear in the solid strength she had come to rely on. It forced them into hiding. He led them to a shallow, dry cave hidden behind a curtain of old man's beard moss, a place so secluded it felt as though it existed outside of time. Here, for 3 days, the world shrank to the size of that small, sheltered space, and their roles were reversed. It was Alara's turn to be the caregiver, the protector. She cleaned the wound with water she boiled over a tiny, smokeless fire, using a strip of her own petticoat as a cloth. Her hands, she was surprised to find, were steady. The task was grim, the sight of his torn flesh turning her stomach, but she pushed the feeling aside. From a small sewing kit her mother had insisted she pack, a kit intended for mending lace, not men, she took a needle and thread. She sterilized the needle in the fire's flame, just as she had read in a book on household medicine years ago, a piece of trivial knowledge that had suddenly become the key to his survival. Stitching his skin back together was the hardest thing she had ever done. Kale did not flinch or cry out. He lay on his back, his jaw tight, his eyes closed, enduring the pain with a stoicism that was both admirable and heartbreaking. A fine sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead, and his good hand clenched and unclenched at his side. But he made no sound. In his vulnerability, she saw a new dimension of his strength. She saw the boy who had survived a blizzard, the man who had faced down a world of hatred without complaint. As she drew the final stitch and knotted the thread, her love for him, which had been a growing, uncertain thing, solidified into an unbreakable resolve. In that quiet cave, tending to his wound, she knew with a certainty that shook her to her soul that she would die for him, just as she knew he would die for her. When his fever broke and he was able to travel again, they moved on. Their steps now pointed back toward the place where her world had ended. They reached the clearing at sunset. The sight was a physical blow. knocking the wind from her lungs. The blackened, skeletal timbers of the cabin clawed at the sky like the fingers of a corpse reaching from its grave. The ground was a carpet of black ash. But already, stubborn green weeds were pushing their way through, life asserting itself amidst the desolation. It was a graveyard, not just of a building, but of all her dreams, all her hopes, all the sweet and simple plans she and Thomas had made. She walked forward alone, her feet making soft, crunching sounds in the ash. Cale stayed back, by the tree line, his presence a silent, unwavering anchor of support, giving her the space she needed for this final farewell. She reached the hearth, the great stone fireplace that was the only part of the cabin still standing, a solitary, tombstone-like monument. She laid her palm against the cold, soot-stained stones. "Goodbye, Thomas," she whispered, the words swallowed by the vast, empty silence. She said goodbye to him, to the gentle, kind man he had been. She said goodbye to the woman she had been, the one who had worn a white lace dress and believed in a future as bright and solid as the pine logs that now lay in ruins around her. A few final tears tracked paths through the grime on her cheeks. Then she wiped them away, took a deep breath, and turned. Her time for grieving was over. Now was the time for justice. With grim determination, they began to work. The stones of the hearth were heavy, settled deep into the earth. They pried at them with a charred piece of timber, their hands digging into the crevices, their muscles straining. They worked for hours as darkness fell, their only light from a sliver of moon. Their fingers grew raw, their nails split and bled. Despair began to creep in, a cold and bitter thing. Perhaps her memory was wrong. Perhaps it had all been a foolish fantasy. Just as she was about to give up, to collapse in the ashes and admit defeat, her fingers, probing a joint between two large, flat stones at the base, felt something give, a slight shift, a looseness. "Cale," she breathed, her voice tight with a sudden, wild hope. Together, they put all their weight against the stone. It grated, scraped, and then tilted forward, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. And there, nestled in the cavity, wrapped in a thick piece of oilcloth, was a book. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. It was heavy, solid, real. She untied the cord that bound the oilcloth and peeled back the protective covering. It was a leather-bound ledger, just as she had imagined. She opened it to the first page. Thomas's neat, precise handwriting filled the lines. It was all there. Dates, names, figures. A meticulous, damning record of Silas Blackwood's criminal empire. Coded entries detailing land grabs, rustled cattle herds, payments to a corrupt sheriff. It was the proof. It was their weapon. A wave of triumphant, righteous joy washed over her. The triumph was a fleeting, fragile thing, a voice dripping with cruel amusement, sliced through the night. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." They spun around. Figures emerged from the deep shadows of the surrounding pines, their forms dark and menacing, and stepping out in front of them, his face illuminated by the moonlight, was Silas Blackwood himself. He was not alone. A dozen of his men fanned out behind him, their rifles held at the ready, effectively surrounding the hearth. He had known. He had anticipated they would return, and he had had the ruins watched. His smile was a triumphant, ugly slash in his face. His eyes were not on them, but on the ledger in Alara's hand. He took a few steps closer, savoring his victory. He began to speak, his voice a gloating, self-satisfied drawl. "I have to admire your persistence," he said, his gaze finally flicking to Alara, "and your choice of companion. Though I must say, I am disappointed. I always pictured you with a man of better stock." He laughed, and the sound was like stones grinding together. "You went to a lot of trouble for that little book. Thomas was a fool to ever write any of it down. But then, he was a fool in many ways. a weak man, full of silly dreams about love and honesty. He would not sell me his land when I offered. He would not see reason. Silas's face hardened, the pretense of amusement dropping away. He had something I wanted, this land, and he was in my way, so I removed him. He confessed it all, right there in the graveyard of her dreams. He spoke of killing Thomas as if he were discussing the swatting of a fly. He spoke of burning the cabin to destroy any evidence, to wipe the slate clean. His words were sharp, deliberate barbs, designed to break her, to show her the absolute futility of her fight, to grind her spirit into the very ashes at her feet. But Ilara did not break, as his ugly, self-serving monologue washed over her. Something inside her went perfectly still and cold. The last of her fear burned away, leaving behind an ice-cold, diamond-hard rage. Cale shifted beside her, a subtle movement, his body tensing for a fight he knew they could not win. "When I move," he whispered, his voice so low it was barely a breath. "You run with the book. Do not look back." He was preparing to sacrifice himself, to buy her a few precious seconds with his life. But Ilara had another plan. Over the past few days, she had been observing the world through his eyes. She had studied the terrain, noted the direction of the strong, prevailing wind that always picked up after dusk. She had seen the dead. Dry pines that stood close to the clearing, their needles and bark as flammable as paper. And while Silas had been gloating, she had subtly, carefully, worked her way a few feet closer to the small, smokeless campfire they had foolishly thought was hidden, its embers still glowing a dull red in the darkness. The confrontation reached its peak. "Now," Silas said, his voice hard with command. "Give me the book, and then we will finish what I started." He gestured to his men, and they began to move forward, their rifles raising. In that split second before the world erupted, Cale looked at her. His eyes were filled with a desperate, loving, and final plea. "Run!" He was about to launch himself at them, a doomed, heroic act. But Ilara met his gaze with a look of fierce, unwavering determination. Her lips formed a single, silent word. "Trust me." In a swift, shocking movement that no one could have anticipated, she did not run. She lunged toward their small fire, grabbed a burning branch, and spun around. With all her strength, she shoved the flaming brand into a thick pile of dry tinder and dead leaves that had gathered at the base of a stand of pines, directly upwind of Silas and his men. The landscape, tinder dry from the long, hot summer, did not hesitate. The fire caught instantly, not as a flicker, but as an explosion. A wall of flame erupted with a deafening roar, racing through the dry underbrush, leaping into the lower branches of the pines. It roared toward Silas and his men with terrifying, unstoppable speed. She had taken the very element of her destruction and turned it into her weapon of salvation. Chaos erupted. Silas's men, who had been confident predators moments before, screamed in panic as the wildfire rushed toward them. Their horses reared and whinnied in terror, their eyes wide and white. In the confusion, in the billowing clouds of smoke and a rain of burning embers, Cale and Ilara acted. Cale became a deadly shadow in the flickering, hellish light. Using the smoke and fire as cover, he moved with a lethal precision, his rifle cracking, picking off Silas's men as they were silhouetted against the advancing flames. Ilara was not a passive victim to be rescued. She clutched the precious ledger to her chest with one arm. In her other hand, she held a small pistol she had taken from one of the ranch hands they had fought at the livery. She fired not to kill, but to create more chaos, to make the horses bolt, to defend the path of their escape. The final confrontation came down to Silas. He was cut off from his men, his face contorted with a mask of pure, murderous rage. He saw Ilara near the edge of the blaze and lunged for her. "The book, you witch!" he screamed. She did not scream or cower. She stood her ground, the fire at her back, the pistol raised, but before she could fire, Cale was there, intercepting Silas's charge. The fight between them was brutal, primal, a desperate struggle of two men set against the backdrop of the raging forest fire. They crashed to the ground, rolling in the ash, their grunts and the thud of their blows lost in the roar of the inferno. It ended when Cale, landing a solid blow to Silas's head, sent him stumbling backward, blinded by smoke, disoriented and enraged. Silas took one staggering step too far and fell directly into the path of the advancing flames he had, in his own way, started. His scream was high and short, quickly consumed by the fire's roar. Justice, in the end, was not delivered by a hangman's noose, but by a poetic, fiery end. Cale grabbed Alara's hand, and they ran. They plunged into the dark woods, away from the heat, the smoke, and the screams, the inferno lighting their path. They escaped, clinging to each other, a testament to their shared will to survive. They had the ledger. Silas was dead. They had won. But as they collapsed, miles away, gasping for air, their bodies bruised and burned, they looked back at the orange glow that lit up the night sky. The cost was immense. They were exhausted, wounded, and surrounded by a burning world of their own making. A perfect, terrible mirror of the ashes where their story had begun. The cave Cale led them to was a deep, cool wound in the side of a mountain, miles from the angry orange glow that stained the night sky behind them. The air within was still and smelled of stone and ancient dust. Here, in the immediate, hollow aftermath of the fire, they collapsed. The adrenaline that had fueled their fight for survival drained away, leaving them with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that was both physical and emotional. The world outside was a smoldering ruin, but inside their small sanctuary, they tended to each other. Alara's hands, which had stitched his arm, were now blistered with burns from flying embers. Cale, with his one good hand, gently cleaned the wounds and applied a poultice of chewed leaves that cooled the angry skin. He had a dozen cuts and bruises of his own, and she cleaned them with a quiet, focused tenderness. They did not speak much. Words were too small for what they had endured. Instead, they held each other, drawing a silent, desperate strength from the simple, solid contact of their bodies, from the shared rhythm of their breathing, a testament to the impossible fact that they had both survived. The leather-bound ledger sat between them on the cave floor, a heavy, tangible symbol of their victory, and of all they had lost to achieve it. When they finally left the cave days later, the journey back toward civilization was different. The immediate, terrifying threat of Silas Blackwood was gone, a ghost consumed by the flames, but a vast and uncertain future loomed before them. The world felt quieter, emptier. They walked through a landscape still hazy with smoke, the air sharp with the scent of burned pine. "What will we do with it?" Alara asked one evening, her voice soft as she looked at the ledger resting in Cale's lap. "The sheriff in Harmony Creek is Blackwood's man," Cale said, his voice a low rumble. Giving it to him would be like giving it back to the devil himself. They decided, together, that their journey was not over. They would not stop at Harmony Creek. They would travel further, for weeks if they had to the territorial capital. There, they might find a man beyond the reach of Silas's corruption, a U.S. Marshal, perhaps, or a circuit judge. Someone with the authority to see that real justice was done, to unravel the web of fear and deceit that Blackwood had woven across the territory. Their quest had a new, final destination. This journey was a period of quiet reflection, a slow, deep healing of the soul. The wild landscape, which had once been a source of terror for Alara, now felt like a sanctuary. The harshness she had feared, she now saw as a form of honesty, the resilience of a lone flower pushing up through the hard, cracked earth, the unwavering strength of the mountains against the sky. She saw beauty in it all. She had been stripped of everything she thought she was, and in its place, she had grown into a woman who was as tough and resilient as the land itself. She had become a part of it, just like Cale. They talked more than they ever had before, their words filling the silence around their small campfires at night. The barriers between them, erected by their different worlds, had been burned away. Alara spoke of her family back east, of the suffocating pressures and expectations of her old life, a life that now felt as distant and foreign as a half-remembered dream. She spoke of the woman she was supposed to be, and how that woman felt like a stranger to her now. In turn, Cale shared the painful, fractured story of his childhood. He spoke of his Pawnee mother, of her quiet strength and the stories she told of the stars. He spoke of his white father, a restless trapper who had never truly claimed him. He told her of a life caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. He spoke of the insults, the mistrust, the loneliness, a burden he had carried with a stoicism that she now understood was a shield for a deeply wounded heart. This final sharing of their deepest wounds, their most private sorrows, was the last step in forging their souls together. They were no longer just two survivors. They were one. When they finally reached the territorial capital, the city was a jarring shock to their systems. After weeks in the vast, silent wilderness, the noise was an assault. The rumble of wagons, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the cacophony of 100 conversations at once, the crowds of people, hurrying and shoving, felt claustrophobic. And the eyes, the quick, judging glances that took in Alara's worn duster and Cale's native features, were a harsh reminder that the prejudices of Harmony Creek were not confined to one small, dusty town. They found the office of a federal marshal, a hard-bitten, graying man named Elias Thorne, whose face was a roadmap of tough miles and tougher fights. He listened to their incredible story without interruption, his sharp, intelligent eyes moving from Alara's earnest face to Cale's watchful one. When they were finished, Alara placed the ledger on his desk. Thorne opened it, his finger tracing the lines of Thomas's neat script. He was silent for a long time, a grim, professional interest hardening his features. He recognized names. She could tell. He saw the patterns of corruption she and Cale had only guessed at. Finally, he looked up, his gaze direct and serious. "You have done a great service to this territory," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "And you have my word. Justice will be done." Their quest, the purpose that had driven them for weeks, was officially over. With that purpose fulfilled, they were left facing the most difficult question of all. What now? The justice they had fought for belonged to the world of men, a world of laws and cities, but did they belong to it? Alara had family back east, money in a bank. She could, if she chose, take a train and return to her former life, attempt to reclaim some semblance of her social standing, and perhaps, in time, this brutal chapter would fade into a scar. Cale could disappear back into the mountains, back to the solitary, silent life he had always known. The world they had fought so hard to survive in together was now offering them, with a casual cruelty, a chance to be apart. The social pressures were immense, a palpable force in the city streets. They received looks, heard the whispers. A future for a respectable white woman and a half-breed tracker was not just frowned upon. It was seen as impossible, a scandal that would follow them wherever they went. They stood on a hill overlooking the bustling city as the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the valley. The air was cool, and Alara pulled the old duster, Cale's duster, tighter around her shoulders. She had been quiet for a long time, her heart heavy with the unspoken choice that lay between them. Cale's face, in the fading light, was etched with a familiar, painful stoicism that she now knew was a mask for his deepest fears. He broke the silence, his voice low and rough, as if the words were being torn from him. "You are free now, Alara," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "You can go home, take a train back east. Forget all of this. Forget me." It was an act of ultimate, selfless love. He was offering her an escape, not from him, but from the life of prejudice and scorn she would face by his side. He was trying to give her back the world she had lost, even if it meant losing her forever. She turned to him, and her eyes were filled not with the tears of sadness he expected, but with a fierce, unwavering certainty that shone brighter than the last rays of the setting sun. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "Home is not a place on a map anymore. Cale," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It is not a house or a town. I burned my old home to the ground, remember?" She turned her head, looking away from the noisy, crowded city below, toward the vast, wild lands that stretched out beyond it, a sea of purple and gold in the twilight. "That is our home. You are my home, Cale." She met his stunned gaze, her heart in her eyes. "The thought of going back to that old life, of leaving you, that is a fate worse than any hardship we have faced. I choose you. I choose this." She squeezed his hand. "This wild, uncertain life. I choose it over the hollow comfort of a world that would never accept us together anyway." His stoic mask finally, completely broke. The relief and overwhelming love that flooded his eyes were so powerful they made her breath catch. With a sound that was half sob, half laugh, he pulled her into a deep embrace, his arms wrapping around her as if he would never let her go. He kissed her then, a kiss not of raw passion or desperate survival, but of profound peace and absolute certainty. It was a promise. It was a vow more sacred and true than any she would have exchanged in a church. The final scene of their story did not take place in a city, but months later. As spring returned to the mountains, they had come back to the land where Thomas's cabin once stood. The great fire had cleared the way for new life. The blackened earth was now covered in a vibrant carpet of green shoots and a riot of wildflowers, bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and sunny yellow buttercups. They had not rebuilt the old cabin in the same spot. Instead, a little further up the creek, in a quiet, sun-dappled clearing of their own choosing. They were building a new home. It was smaller, sturdier, built of stone from the creek bed and timber they had felled and squared with their own two hands. The story ends not with a grand declaration or a dramatic event, but with a simple, quiet moment. Elara was on her knees in a small patch of tilled earth, a garden, her hands buried in the rich, dark soil, planting seeds. Cale was on the roof of their new home, carefully setting the last of the shingles in place. He paused in his work, looking down at her, a small, genuine smile gracing his lips, a sight still so rare and precious it made her heart ache with joy. She felt his gaze and looked up, her own smile mirroring his. There were no words needed between them. They had faced the darkest of tragedies, survived the harshest of lands, and defied a prejudiced and unforgiving society. They had found their justice, their peace, and their home, not in the world of men with its fickle laws and cruel whispers, but in the steadfast wilderness and in each other. Their love, forged in fire and tempered by tears, was the strong, unshakable foundation upon which they would build their new life, a quiet, beautiful testament to hope blooming from the ashes. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.